Okay, hello everyone. Uh, I wanted to again cover the new news, the big news of the last few weeks, which is the immigration crackdown, this Supreme Court ruling that just came down, which is a big one, and then Trump's tax bill. And I just finished a pod on the immigration crackdown, so now I'm going to move on to the Supreme Court ruling. And I don't know how much time I'm going to spend on this. I actually think the news coverage on this one has been pretty good. Um, but I will sort of do a little more both sides of the issue than most folks I think have been hearing on the news, and then a little bit of analysis of the upshot of it. Shouldn't take too long on that one because that one's kind of straightforward. So if I have time on this pod, I'll move on to the tax bill. But if not, if the Supreme Court ruling video takes longer than I anticipate, then I'll save the tax bill for another pod. So let's start with the Supreme Court ruling. So this is an issue that's come up through several presidencies. It came up in the Obama presidency, and in Trump 1, and in the Biden presidency, and now again in Trump 2. And what this is it's a ruling about the relationship between the lower federal courts and the federal Supreme Court. So remember, the federal court system has sort of three layers to it. There's a lower court, a lower district federal court, which, different areas of the United States, different districts have their own district level federal court. And then there's the appellate courts, which if somebody doesn't like a ruling at the lower court, the folks who lose at the lower court can appeal to the appellate courts. And those are also district-based, area-based in the United States. And then if the folks who lose at the appellate court want to, they can then appeal the ruling to the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court gets to decide, basically whether they want to hear that case or not, if they think it has national import. But if they do, they'll probably hear it. And then when they decide, that's the official law of the land. In all of the land, all of the states, everyone in the United States. So lately, it means, mostly in the last 20, 25 years or so, presidents have been initiating national policies without going through Congress, because Congress has been very non-functional in the last few decades. So presidents have basically been unilaterally starting new policies through what's called executive orders, where the president just writes an order and signs it and now tries to make that the law of the land. Now, technically, presidents are very restricted as to what they can actually do through executive order. For example, anything that involves taxation or federal spending is technically supposed to go through the Congress and be voted on by the Congress. But again, Congress has been so non-functional over the last few decades that a lot of presidents, most of the presidents, have actually just gotten frustrated that things they really want to see happen haven't been even considered and don't look like they're going to get a hearing in Congress. And so the president just writes an executive order and signs it and tries to make it the law of the land. Now, usually when presidents do that, the order gets challenged in the federal courts. So somebody doesn't like it, they challenge it in the federal court. Now, there's sort of three different ways that you can bring a case in a federal court. You can bring it on behalf of just one or a few clients, people who are presumably affected by the ruling. You can bring it on behalf of a whole state, where the state feels like it's being affected in a negative way by the ruling. or you can bring it in what's called a class action suit, where you get a small number, relatively small number, a group of people who are all affected by the ruling in the same, by the law in the same way, and then you try to get that group certified as a class action so that the ruling will apply not just to folks in that group, but to everybody who's like them, who's affected in that same way in the United States. So one example of that, for example, would be, let's suppose that Trump's deporting. We talked about this in the immigration practice. Trump's deporting people who have green cards without really going through due process. So if I wanted to stop him from doing that at the federal level, because Congress never approved that, so I can bring a federal suit on behalf of everyone with a green card, and I can certify as a class action by getting, let's say a few dozen people with green cards who have been affected by this ruling, who are being in the process of being deported, and then sue, take it to court, say, these clients represent everybody with a green card in the United States who's subject now to deportation. And if it gets certified as class action, then any ruling will then apply to everyone in the country with a green card. Now, a couple of problems with that. One is that the Supreme Court decides whether something is a legitimate class action. So, for example, if they don't like the idea of applying a ruling to everyone, they can just decertify the class action. So that puts a lot of power at the Supreme Court. So how were things before this ruling and how are things now? What did this ruling actually change? Well, what this ruling changed is that previously, any lower court judge in any of those three kinds of suits, kinds of cases, could certify a national injunction, meaning that they could decide that, okay, this issue that you brought to me is really a national issue, and this law change I don't agree with. I don't think it's constitutional, so I'm going to just stop it for the whole nation. So, for example, a federal court judge in the 13th district, who got a suit on behalf of just a few individuals, could say, yeah, you're right. This is a bad policy. It's unconstitutional that the president's trying to do, so I'm stopping it for the whole country. I'm stopping it for you, but also for the entire country. And the Supreme Court ultimately is going to have to decide, but for now, things are just going to stay as they are. And so before this ruling, just regular federal justices at the lowest levels of the court, any regular federal justice, just one, anywhere in the country, could basically stop a presidential order that applied to the entire country if they thought it was unconstitutional. Now, when they stop it, that doesn't mean it's gone forever. It just means that they're staying it, which means that, staying means things stay just as they are right now before the ruling. And they are staying the change until the Supreme Court has a chance to rule on it. So that's how it's been. Lower court justices in any kind of case, whether it was brought by a state, whether it was brought class action, or whether it was brought just by a few individuals. And no matter which district court it was brought to, any judge in the lower courts could basically stop an executive order from going through until it was adjudicated at the Supreme Court, if they thought it was unconstitutional. Now, presidents, and this is both Democratic and Republican presidents, who, haven't liked this. So, for example, Biden, who's a Democrat, he wanted to do forgiveness of student loans. And so he just did that because he couldn't get Congress to rule on it. he did it by executive order. He just wrote an executive order saying, these student loans are now forgiven up to this amount. But, a number of folks brought class action suits or brought suits just on behalf of a few individuals in various districts, and in a couple of districts, the judge ruled against Biden and said, you can't do this, and basically did a stay for the whole country so that Biden could not do the loan forgiveness. And Biden was very mad about that. He was mad that, some, regular district court federal judge in Texas, South Texas, based on a suit brought by one individual or a couple of individuals, could just stop his whole national loan forgiveness program. He didn't like it. So he was bothered, to be fair, he was bothered by this. So this has bothered the fact that lower court judges could do this, could stop executive orders, regardless of the kind of case that was brought to them about it, has pissed off Democratic presidents and Republican presidents. Of course, Trump himself has had like 12 of his executive orders stopped this way, including the one that this case was about, which was his executive order making it so that people who were born, even people who were born here but their parents weren't citizens, are not citizens. He said they're not citizens, even though the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, says that they are citizens. If you're born here, you're a citizen. So Trump tried to end by executive order birthright citizenship, which is a well-established constitutional principle. And of course, the suits were brought by states and by lower courts, and the number of judges put stays on that order. So what the Supreme Court ruled, they finally took up a case where that particular case where they decided that they were actually not going to rule on whether Trump's executive order was constitutional, which it pretty clearly isn't. But they were going to use this case to rule on the power of lower court judges to stop national executive orders through what's called nationwide injunction, which is when any lower court judge in any kind of case basically thinks that an executive order is unconstitutional, they just stop it. They say, no, you can't do this, and it's stopped nationwide. So what the Supreme Court ruled in this case is that you can only do that through a class action lawsuit. That is, the only way a lower court judge can actually stop an executive order nationwide is if a class action suit is brought to them. So and if it's certified class action by the Supreme Court. So two things have to be true. They have to get a class action suit on the executive order, and the Supreme Court has to certify that it's a proper class action suit. Now, in that case, the judge can do a nationwide injunction on behalf of everyone who's in that class, no matter what state they're in. But the other kinds of cases, when you're just bringing a case on behalf of like a few individuals, or one individual, but it's not class action, or if you bring a case on behalf of an entire state, the judge's rulings at the lower courts cannot be nationwide injunctions in either of those cases. So they can't stop the ruling nationwide. In the case of where one person or a few people bring the case, the judge's ruling only applies to that one person or those few people, not to anybody else in the country. In the case of a state action against an executive order, the judge's ruling only applies to people who are residents of that state, but not to any of the other states. Okay, so basically what this does is it makes it harder for lower court judges to do nationwide injunctions, to stop an executive order when they get a case related to the executive order. Only one type of case can do that now in the lower courts, and that's a certified class action case. And only the Supreme Court can certify the class action. So the Supreme Court has really narrowed the ability of lower courts to exert their power over an executive order. They've basically reserved much more of that power now to themselves. The Supreme Court now has more power because ultimately the Supreme Court can rule that an executive order is unconstitutional and stop it nationwide, but it has to be their ruling. And also, they also get to decide whether a class action suit, which is the only way a lower court can stop an executive order nationwide, they get to certify whether it's legitimate class action suit. So this concentrates more power in the executive. That is, the president can get away with executive orders more easily, even if they seem unconstitutional, and it concentrates more federal court power in the Supreme Court and takes it away from the lower courts and lower court judges. So basically now lower court judges are only good for, in most cases, just rulings that apply to their district or to a few people or to states, individual states, but not to federal orders that, executive orders that are basically new federal laws. It's pretty much taken the lower courts mostly out of the federal law assessing business and concentrating that power in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court these days, of course, has a very large conservative majority. So, this behooves the conservatives, conservative presidents, and the conservative court. And so the likely effect of this is conservative presidents will get more of their work done without having to go through Congress. And it's more likely to be upheld and certified by the courts. So that's where we are. And this is an issue that really had to be decided because, as I said, it's affected both Democratic and Republican presidents. And so there's been calls for the Supreme Court, to resolve this issue for many years. And so, now they've resolved it. But the way they resolved it can create some chaos because, for example, with the case that they actually used, which is Trump's executive order making people who are born to non-citizen parents non-citizens, even if they were born in the U.S. Now the case is that this issue is now chaos nationally because some states brought suits against this, and the courts ruled in favor of the states. So those states, I think there were 22 states, where the courts actually ruled that people born in those states, even the non-citizens, are citizens. But then there are 28 states where the executive order would rule because the courts haven't ruled on it yet. And so we have 22 states where right now, if you're born to non-citizens, you're a non-citizen, and then 28 states where if you're born to, or 22 states where if you're born to a non-citizen, you're a citizen, and then 28 states where if you're born to a non-citizen, you're not a citizen. And it's going to stay that way until the Supreme Court weighs in on the actual law, which is, is that executive order constitutional or not? And the Supreme Court's already put that off until their next session and probably won't rule on that for another year. So we have this time frame of a year where different districts and different states will have basically different laws related to who gets citizenship and who doesn't, who's born with it and who isn't. And so that's a very chaotic situation. And that situation is going to be magnified because it wasn't just this one case that, where the lower courts had issued national injunctions against Trump's executive order. He's actually got 12 executive orders, I think, where some related to immigration, some related to, dissolving departments at the federal level and appropriating money that Congress has used for other things. And, all those have been stayed nationally by lower court rulings, but I don't think any of them have had certified class action suits. So again, now you're going to get this patchwork where, you know, those laws apply to some folks but not to others until the Supreme Court has a chance to adjudicate the actual executive order and decide whether it's constitutional or not, which for some of these laws probably won't be for a couple of years yet. So the bottom line is, although people on both sides of the aisle have wanted the court to rule on this issue, the court's ruling, the one that they decided on, is going to create a lot of chaos, a lot of legal chaos, where executive orders apply to part of the country but not to the rest of the country until for 6 months, for a year, for 2 years, and that's just, I don't know how tenable that's really going to be. It's going to create such legal chaos that and confusion that I think eventually the courts are going to decide that this is just not a tenable situation. They may have to eventually change this ruling to something else that makes more legal sense and doesn't create as much legal chaos. But that's where we are right now. So that was the Supreme Court ruling. That's the background of it, and who it applies to and when. So since I took longer than I thought I would on that Supreme Court ruling case, I think I'll stop this video, and then we'll do a whole separate pod on the tax bill, which it probably deserves anyway. So anyway, I hope that made things clear to you about the Supreme Court ruling. I hope. Maybe it didn't. But in any case, I'll see you soon.